Welcome back to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin.
I'm Bobby Mixa.
And today, Bobby, I am wearing my lumberjack shirt because we are going to talk about men and masculinity. What is the problem with men today? So you ready?
I'm ready. I didn't know that I should wear my lumberjack shirt as well, but here we go.
Well, that's okay. I know you just finished, you just got up from the bench press and, you couldn't be expected to go upstairs and put on something else. So anyway, we joke, but we do want to approach this as a serious topic because one of the reasons we want to talk about men and masculinity is it's increasingly the case that people are realizing that we've got a real problem with our men. We've got young men who are living lives of despair, who are unable to kind of figure out what their purpose is. We have, in the worst case scenario, men who are, acting out violently, who are embracing strange ideas that really are not very not only just sort of not respectable in our society today, but not very useful. They don't serve much of a purpose. They're just sort of like playing pretend, and I think that that's maybe something we'll get into as far as other aspects of men are concerned as well. There's a lot of kind of playing pretend because a lot of guys just don't know what they're supposed to be doing. So let me throw it to you to start because it was your idea to have this conversation, an idea to which I quickly assented and agreed that it's an important one for us to talk about together. So, Bobby, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, well, I guess the idea came when I saw that at the top of the charts for Amazon books was a new book. It came out, I think, like 2 weeks ago. A book by a guy named Scott Galloway, who is a NYU business professor. I think he teaches marketing at NYU Business School. But Scott Galloway is quite a media icon on the left, and the fact that he came out with a new book called Notes on Being a Man, and he's getting all this publicity around the book. I thought that was just interesting, and in light of a lot of conversations that are actually being had on the right about some developments amongst like some concerns about where some young men are going in some radical directions, namely with the influence of Nick Fuentes and some others on the right, like what's his name? Is it Andrew Tate? And some of the others. It's
Can
just
we?
a conversation worth having. And anyways, as a school teacher, I've been dealing with a lot of these young guys for a number of years, watching them in like for the past. I've been teaching the past 10 years. And so it's just interesting to kind of get a take on what's going on with young men. And clearly there's a huge difference. And so all these things that most of these people are observing with young men, I see in the classroom. And there's clearly a difference with a lot of young women. It seems like they're succeeding with the kind of the system that we have, especially educational system. But young men are struggling. And I thought that a lot of the concerns like that we've been talking about, kind of like with the crisis of meaning, there needing to be like a goal and a challenge in a young man's life, a need to go through something like being sent on mission is just so key, and also to have like other men to kind of be mentors to these young men is kind of lacking today. And so somebody like a Scott Galloway is pointing a lot of these things out, which I think it's incredibly important that he's doing that. And I don't agree with him, I think, on all of his like solutions for this, but it's a discussion worth having.
Yeah. I wonder if I could just editorialize for 1 second and say something about these so-called, these sort of right, these so-called right figures of the right. People like Nick Fuentes and Andrew Tate and the like. I do not agree that they're men of the right. And so this is an area where I really think that we need to kind of assert something different. Like it's just sort of like, and I do it too, but it's just something that we stipulate. We say, okay, there's sort of,
I mean,
there's
we're
sort of,
described that way by the media, and we just repeat what they say.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I mean, even in these think pieces that are going around, like sort of saying, like, the right needs to kind of police itself, or like the right has this problem on its fringes, or like whatever that is. I just reject all of that. I don't now, and I never have believed that people like Nick Fuentes are in any way a fellow traveler to somebody who believes in, conserving and and promoting kind of the best values of Western civilization.
Because what are they conserving? I mean, it just seems like a lot of these people have pointed out, like Roger Eyre and like this latest couple of articles, there's like a nihilism
Yeah.
that's there.
Yeah. And that, I think, is precisely what we have for a long time. Since we started this project, we have been speaking against this nihilism. We are men of hope. I mean, it's not to say, though, that there are. I do believe there is some variety on the right, just as there is on the left or wherever else, in terms of like what the problem is, what the solutions may be, all these kinds of things. And some of these options may be more radical than others or something. But I just wanted to flag that right off to say, I don't think that as we approach these problems of kind of, what's good for men, that we need to kind of even acknowledge I mean, it's tricky, right? Because I mean, I suppose that there is a little bit of a kind of tunnel that you can go down, or there's sort of, you go from this person to this person to this person, and suddenly you've arrived at Andrew Tate or Nick Fuentes. I get it, and probably that doesn't mean that you've been going in the direction of, AOC and Mamdani or like whatever, and then, oh, hey, how about this Nick Fuentes guy? Even if all of them may or may not be anti-Semites, right? I mean, so there are these different trajectories. I get that. But as I think, try to speak some hope to men, I think that we can at the same time kind of stand up and say, we don't see that expression of kind of the place where some of these, I don't know, some of these, like some of this confusion about what it means to be a man is like, we don't think that is a very natural progression for it to end up in a place like that.
Yeah. But it's interesting that a lot of these guys today, there's this like, I don't know if there's a return to something like we've talked about Bronze Age pervert BAP, who's really famous on X. But this return to this kind of animism, almost like a kind of Nietzschean Übermensch, where we'll go back to the Bronze Age, where, we weren't, constrained by civilization, and we'll be like, Conan the Barbarian, and just like have this kind of total, like almost like freedom of this kind of, if whatever this barbaric spirit is, to kind of conquer and dominate. And we need to return to something like that. And it's just kind of weird where you see a lot of these young guys getting even into diets where it's like all they're eating is to go back to this kind of like this age where it's like almost this kind of primordial age. And we've been corrupted by the civilization and agriculture, and you're all eating just, kind of processed bread now, and not being very, very manly.
Yeah.
So
a couple quick thoughts about that. One is, we've talked about this Bapism phenomenon before, and I've written about that, and maybe I'll come back to that in just a second. But your comments about kind of the diet thing called to mind for me a documentary that I watched recently on Netflix about this character called the Liver King, and some of our listeners will have heard of him. He was a man. He is a man. He's still alive, and I think still doing everything he's been doing. But he started this company where he created these supplements, these liver supplements, and he quickly became this advocate for eating organ meats and for it was very much based about diet and all that sort of thing. Now, I have no problem with that. I do actually think that diet is kind of one of the biggest problems that we have. But he ended up becoming this YouTube phenomenon, especially during, I think, maybe the worst part of the pandemic, and then it kind of carried on from there. And people who were watching him, he talked about ancestral all the time. And he was always sort of out shooting things and ripping livers out and eating them raw on camera and, stuff like this. But this documentary really shows that, like, obviously, if you stop and think about it, you realize that there is a high degree of artifice to this this production and even to this person, right?
Yeah.
But something else that's related to this that came up that people began to notice as his videos began to get hundreds of thousands and then millions of views was that it appeared that this man who was advocating this kind of ancestral lifestyle, which by the way included things like eating 24 eggs a day or something. I mean, did our ancestors do that? Of course not. I mean, like they weren't eating gluttonously. They, so right there, that's just kind of absurd. But they also noticed that his physique, and he's a little older than I am. I think he's in his like mid to late 40s. That his physique was just completely unnatural looking. That he had just this enormous upper body that anybody who's ever kind of worked out seriously knows is almost impossible to achieve, especially after a certain age, without the assistance of some kind of steroids, right? Again and again, he denied this. And then finally, he admitted it. He just admitted it. And in this video that he made where he talked about it, he basically said, look, like more than 80% of the population, I suffer from low self-esteem. So that's the explanation right there. Like all of this ancestral mythology, the strength, the liver, this whole lifestyle that he was sort of trying to create basically came down to he didn't feel good about himself. And he had an opportunity to project this other person, which, last point, then I'll throw it back to you, which reminds me of, one of the fictions that maybe we want to explore a little bit that a lot of men buy into who are searching for identity, which is this kind of bodybuilder persona that we see in this BAP character, but we see in a lot of other guys as well. And hey, we both work out to contradict something that one commenter actually made on our YouTube channel one time. Somebody said that we need to go lift, and well, we do actually, guys. We do take health and fitness really seriously, but when you see these kind of bodybuilder types, and especially the ones who use steroids, they're frankly, a lot of women have said this. My own wife has said it in particular, but there's actually something quite womanly about that. It's really not that manly to be so concerned about your kind of the presentation of your body. Far more manly would be like, what are you using your strength to do? And it seems like this kind of Liver King guy or whatever, I mean, he was using this just to kind of get famous on the internet, right? Mm-hmm. So that's just one of many weird manifestations of this kind of lack of rootedness in men's own identity that we see today. So with that mess, let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, no, it's when you talk about the kind of insecurity at the heart of a lot of this stuff, you wonder too if the technology that we have today, being platformed or having your own platform, and it just is encouraged to kind of be outrageous like this. Like you think about Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes, like the way they talk. I mean, it's inflammatory. It's meant to be provocative. And then that by doing that, you're going to get a lot of views. I mean, it's just inevitable. Not inevitable, but that's going to really be, it's going to get you quite a following on the various social media. But I mean, I think I now know. I just recall who the liver man is, and I think I've seen a picture. Yeah, he looks like completely like outrageous. But it's interesting that in the background when they're doing all this stuff, going back to this ancestral thing. I mean, they're living in they've got all the nice things of the modern age. They've got a toilet, they've got all the lights, they've got a nice home, living probably pretty comfortably, even though they're hitting up the gym every day. But you just wonder if so much of this stuff is kind of compensating for maybe that, like perhaps maybe something that people would have done, like work in the farm and lift really heavy stuff just to get by. They have to do it now in this, and it can kind of be distorted in this other way. I mean, growing up, some of the figures who were pretty manly for me, I never would have thought the guy at the gym who can lift tons of weight was necessary just because of that and looked really buff. And if I heard that he was taking supplements or even steroids to take that would have actually made me think he was less manly for that. But the people who were pretty manly for me, I'll just talk about one example. In so many respects, I could have like a big criticism of my grandpa, but in certain respect, he was a quiet guy. He he was an athlete. He actually made a ton of things in the house. I mean, he made he was really like a craftsman. Um, and he'd always come to my baseball games and like give me little tips, but wasn't someone to talk too much. He was he was very what's the word for about the Spartans? Is it laconic? Okay, in the
Yeah.
sense that he just didn't say much. But I never could imagine him. He was quite a strong guy. And for me, that was like a great example. And then I'll even talk about my own father. My dad, I never saw my dad, I guess, lifted a little bit when he was in high school with his brothers, but it never really became serious. But he did a ton of stuff around the house, like my grandpa, and was quite, he showed that he could actually do things very well, and was very strong. In fact, stronger than a lot of these like muscle men that I remember. And so I think that like just having these models out there who are not necessarily trying to compensate for something else is incredibly important. But you're not seeing those guys show up on social media.
Hmm.
They don't have these accounts, and in fact, I could never imagine my grandpa ever really starting up an Instagram account or anything like that. It just they never would have done that.
Hmm.
So you wonder what's kind of shaping these things, and that's why I think like the best thing we could do today is just make sure that in the home you become those that influence for your young children.
Yeah. In the article that you sent me about the Scott Galloway article about boys and men, which I think is related to this best-selling book that he has out there.
Yeah.
He talks about a lot of things that are, yeah, things that we've been talking about for a while, about kind of the state of boys and men. He talks about kind of the need for mentorship and all of that sort of thing. And I think like on some level he's identifying what you just said, that like the at the root of the problem is just men not really being fathered properly, not having fathers, coming from divorce or like whatever that may be. I mean, that's stuff that kind of, people on the right, certainly Christians, have been talking about for a long time, and sometimes we've been derided for that sort of thing. And so I guess in a way it's good that we're seeing people kind of with different ideological viewpoints, understanding that there's sort of, that there's something to that. What I'm thinking though, Bobby, and maybe this will take us in a different direction, but, we've talked before about the trades, we've talked whether it's, who is it?
Matthew
The
Crawford.
guy Matthew Crawford, or Mike Rowe, the television guy. He's got a big kind of crusade to kind of get more people into the trades, and especially kind of men. And I think sometimes about the dilemma in the movie Good Will Hunting, where Will Hunting is this mathematical genius, but completely self-taught, and he's resisting the pull to use his intellect to make money, because he understands that it will be co-opted for, whether it's like a defense company or somebody, a financial services company, or like somebody who's basically just going to kind of use his strength for some nefarious purpose. And he decides like he wants to be like his buddy and just kind of do construction, because there's something honorable in that.
Hmm.
But his friend, who's played by Ben Affleck, like really takes him to task and says like, look, this is my life. This is what I'm going to do. And that's fine. But he says, but if you're still doing this when you're 50 years old, he says, I'm going to kill you, because you can't let this go to waste. You have something greater. And so, of course, not to give away the movie, but it would appear he does pursue some kind of life where he gets to use his brain. But the thing that concerns me, Bobby, is, will there still be a world for like, yes, we want to encourage more and more men who don't need to go to college to get right to it and to find purpose and fulfillment in good, meaningful work, you know? But we definitely don't want to discourage men from pursuing careers that are, you know, that involve the life of the mind and that are ultimately going to be the kind of careers that shape society, right? I mean, that sort of have an opportunity to kind of to exhibit real leadership, which a lot of men, probably a lot more men than get the opportunity to do it, are actually good for it, like suited to it.
Yeah.
And this brings me to raising this issue that the writer Helen Andrews has been talking about a little bit lately. She wrote an article about a month ago from when we're recording in mid-November called "The Great Feminization," where she essentially points to the fact that whether it's undergraduate institutions, graduate schools, professional schools, professions themselves like law firms, the medical profession, and many others, these are all worlds that are now majority female.
Yeah.
And, you know, I do wonder what effect that has on young men, kind of looking out on trying to find a place for their adventure, right? Trying to find a place to look out on the world and say, how can I apply my talents in a way that will allow me to be me and will allow me to kind of make a difference in the world that goes beyond just getting married and having children and, you know, and that kind of role, which is obviously at the heart of everything. But I don't know, like, I think I have a lot more to say about this Helen Andrews thing and maybe connect it up with some of the issues we've already raised. But I do worry that sometimes that's a piece that's missing from the discourse where we just say, look, guys just need better mentoring. Guys just need better fathers. Guys just need to kind of be evangelized better, or like whatever these other things may be. But we also have these kind of societal issues that have created a fundamentally different world that young men are kind of growing up into now than even the one we grew up into, right?
No, I know. I mean, well, okay, before we talk about the world that we grew up in, but like I can't imagine some of these men that I looked up to existing in the world that is, of today, in which, we have like so. It just seems like the office culture, the culture is just so different in terms of like what you're allowed to say, the concerns about, which are in some respects good. But the idea, like, also of some people saying, oh, critiquing an office culture that, men are actually bonding in as being perhaps something like a frat, which I know, like, some cultures where or office cultures where men are just actually really just bonding are accused of. But I do think that, like, it's hard for a man to try to aspire, even to get into a place now where he can get into those roles, because of all the education and the credentials that you need to get even get into those positions. They're like so heavily dominated by women. I mean, I don't know what the latest statistics are on universities, but if you look at the ratio between men and women going into the universities, it's like very much women, and you wonder if the education is in some ways being geared much more towards, I mean, people have talked about this, an awful lot. We don't need to get into that, but flourishing in today's, if you want to say, office culture, which, oftentimes these leadership positions, you have to be involved in, that are not going to be geared towards something men would actually find desirable. I don't know about you, but I certainly don't. I mean, I don't think that I was ever really meant to go into the trades. It just, I was never like my neighbor, taking apart, cars and assembling them back together again. I mean, my parents know this about me. The minute I said I was really interested in Matthew Crawford, they said, "Well, you like the ideas that he's presenting, not so much actually doing the work of an electrician." But there was something else, I think, that, like, the frustration of being in the office culture it just didn't suit me. and all of the kind of like, accomplishing, getting something done, all the teams you have to be a part of, all of the meetings that you have to have. It just doesn't really, I think, work. And I'm not saying that it necessarily works well for women, but I do think that it's not something most men are going to find desirable.
Yeah, I just have to flag this that Helen Andrews in her piece, The Great Feminization, there are a lot of choice turns of phrase, but there's one place where she says women can sue their bosses for running a workplace that feels like a fraternity house, but men can't sue when their workplace feels like a Montessori kindergarten.
It's a, yeah. Well,
And
yeah,
look,
maybe I'll bring
let
this
me.
up here, but like I remember, okay, I'll just say this. There was an accusation that our office in Dallas was something like a frat house. And I remember reading that complaint, and I thought, what the heck are you talking about? Because it was just basically in the morning, some guys would just say, "Hey, what'd you do over the weekend?" And there would be chit chat amongst the guys about that stuff, and men would kind of bond together. I didn't see that complaint was valid in any sense. And it made me think that anytime I hear an accusation like that about an organization, I want to do it, a double take. So it's I don't know. I don't know if I should be saying that, but it is interesting that that is the critique that you could have. It's a fraternity, not a sorority. I mean,
Yeah,
look at Fight Club. Fight Club. I mean, how many young men resonate with that movie somehow connects with them? And you don't want them to go in that kind of radical direction. But when everything is like, okay, hey guys, we're going to have like a corporation bonding experience and it's like a therapy session. I don't know if that's going to really work.
yeah. Well, and obviously neither one of us would say that, what we're longing for, sort of the good old days, like in Mad Men or something, where
Yeah.
men can truly act unvirtuously, right? I mean, to say the least, right?
Exactly.
That is not at all what's being suggested. But in some respects, what concerns me, Bobby, is if we're so maybe just to pick up the thing about the trades again. There are moments when I'm wondering if the message is almost something like, look, guys, you don't have to be an Uber driver. You don't, we do want you to get out of your parents' basement. We want you to take responsibility and, get married, have a family. That's all good. We want that. Best case scenario for you guys would be go into the trades where you can work with your hands, you can find satisfaction, and you can probably make a good living. But what we're not saying to you guys is we want you in charge of the world anymore. What we're saying is basically the people who are going to be doing that kind of thing are going to be majority women or men who are willing to kind of work in an environment that has a very feminine quality. Now, people could argue with us, right, and say, look, well, what's so bad about that, right? I mean, even, Helen Andrews says, female group dynamics favor consensus and cooperation, right? Okay, well, what's so bad about consensus and cooperation? Well, nothing really, necessarily, but it is a different model, right, than competition, you know, I'm trying to find the place here in her article where she talks about other things, but right, there's a kind of aggressiveness, there's a kind of, there's a kind of an intensity, which would be kind of the norm in more of a male-oriented workplace. Again, we always want to kind of say what that would mean for, for a virtuous society is it isn't men transgressing, it isn't men sinning, it isn't men sort of operating within that kind of framework in a kind of unvirtuous way, but it is certainly a different way of doing things, right? And this is, again, sort of part of what Helen Andrews talks about here in The Great Feminization. She connects this to the idea of wokeness, because she says that basically, the feminine impulse is to ostracize, right? She I don't know if it's in this article or somewhere else, but other commentators have used the example of kind of the mean girls phenomenon, and this is something that you see play out in group dynamics with women versus men, right? You see kind of ostracization. You see kind of going around someone in order to kind of achieve a goal of silencing their voice. Whereas it's not to say men don't do those kinds of things; they absolutely do. But that in a prior age, those things would have been considered exceptions that prove the rule, right? If a man did that sort of thing, it would have been considered extremely unmanly because that's not what men do, right? I mean, to this day, when you hear kind of sports commentators on the radio, you still hear about people, you still hear about the ideals of kind of, a man, a man-to-man face-off, right? That kind of a thing. Yeah. That language is still with us, but in the kind of upper echelons of society, particularly elite society, those are now considered things to be relics of the past, which I think make it more difficult for men with their natural instinct to participate in those worlds.
Yeah, you got me thinking about a book by Walter Ong. I don't know if you know that name. But he's known for his writings on like literacy and the media age. But he has a great book called Fighting for Life, Contest, Sexuality, and Consciousness. And he really talks about in there like the difference, the kind of almost externality of a man in terms of like a man having to go outside of himself to actually, like in some ways, like find himself. And I'm not saying that all humans are every men and women are called to this, but in men it's very unique, this kind of externality. Just think about in so many respects, like the men when they go through the passage of going from being a boy to becoming a man, it's not just a kind of a biological hormonal thing going through puberty, but you through a lot of these initiation rites, you're sent out on mission. You got to go hunt the wolf, or you have to go through this obstacle course of some kind. And think of how many young men. I mean, like I remember when I was a young guy, in going into high school, there was this like feeling that I needed to go in a way on this adventure to prove myself. It took me out to New Hampshire for a year, but I think that was part of that process of needing that. And so guys will inevitably kind of create something like that for themselves. But you think like too that that externality is so important.
Yeah, and I think, don't you think that for generations our institutions were also pointing in that direction, right? Yeah. And now it seems that our institutions are kind of diminishing that aspect, right? And whether it's kind of I don't know. I mean, maybe
think about it today. Like today, we don't have like the draft, but also this idea that there's no really possibility that you're going to be sent off to war. I mean, but like in the past, there was like always that thought, well, life is just before and after war. I mean, it's like you're always in some ways have to be ready. And I'm not trying to like, glorify warfare, but this kind of idea that you have to be prepared and become a warrior was something that was just a necessity. I mean, and yeah. So you just today, you think a lot of people, it's like, well, warfare. And now we're even having like robots doing our fighting for us. But
right. Yeah, and the military too is an institution that has, I think Helen Andrews would say, and again, we're not necessarily saying everything Helen Andrews is saying is right. I do think it's a provocative thesis that's worth discussing. But I think like people who are serving in the military nowadays would say, yeah, I mean it's an enormous HR apparatus. It's obviously much more feminized than it used to be. It's much more managerial. It's a lot less about kind of preparing you to go fight a war than it used to be. And yeah, I mean, nowadays, whether it is for the purpose of fighting a war or not, I'm a little less inclined to push a young man into a life of, attempting military service. That said, the guys who do, I mean, I think it's attempting to tap into that same kind of, formative adventure, kind of coming of age thing, like you just said. And there was another point that I was going to make about that, but yeah, I mean, I think that it like when I'm around my father-in-law, for example, I went hunting with him one time a few years ago in Kentucky, and most of the other guys who were there were guys who had served in the military. A couple of the other guys who were there had served in Vietnam, like he had. And I mean, that was 2 years of their life, less than 2 years that they were actually fighting in a war. I mean, obviously in other wars, that's longer. But, but it completely defined who they were as men, to the point that now in their 70s, it pretty much is all they want to talk about when they get together, because it was the defining thing that made them the men that they became. Flaws and all. They're men with flaws. There's no doubt about that. But nobody would ever see them and say, that's not a man.
And you think of a lot of the crises today. I mean, like, there's this falling into despair, not having friends. Whereas even though those guys who were coming back from war and were maybe suffering from post-traumatic stress, still they had like a band of brothers that they could go back to. And so many of the young guys, I mean, I grew up on movies. I mean, watching not only like the Band of Brothers, but also some of these movies that are in a way calling you out of yourself, but they seem like dreams that you can't accomplish in today's world. So like, I mean, I grew up on the Batman kind of mythology. I remember I was like 3 years old when the first Batman came out, and my dad is a big Batman fan. So
you're talking about the Tim Burton Batman. Yeah,
the Tim Burton Batman. But this when the Christopher Nolan Batman Begins came out, I was still in high school, but I remember that film, kind of like tapped into this longing that I had, which was kind of like, all right, this ideal, which you love the city and you want to give yourself and serve the city, and but then you have to, because there's this like obstacle to that, the corruption that you need to kind of respond to. You're sent out, and he needs to go in a way. He goes all the way into some kind of like monastery and trains with the Leagues of Shadows, right? And it almost becomes something like a warrior monk in a way. And then he's sent back. He goes back to Gotham, and then becomes something like a vigilante. Now, I'm not like it's saying, hey, we need to start like a militia or like outside the law, be these vigilantes, something like a fascist of some kind. But nevertheless, you could see this like he's the Dark Knight, right? And so I grew up on that. Braveheart is another one of these things where it's like you want to do these things. You want to kind of be like you want to be a knight.
Yeah, and a key thing too, Bobby, with that is you actually have to do them and not just think about them.
Yeah.
And this is the thing this is the concern that I have about a lot of young men today. It's something, it's an ongoing thing that we talk about in a lot of different contexts, but it's about the real, right? So it's one thing to sort of say, like, you're going to strive to be a man based on, listening to Bronze Age Pervert, or maybe if you have the intellect, maybe even reading Nietzsche for yourself, or maybe watching war movies or whatever that may be, right? But I mean, what do we see in the arc of those characters in those war movies? We see precisely this kind of moving from theory to reality. We see the kind of the fresh-faced, idealistic kid who wants to go fight, and then once the fighting starts, he realizes it's something else. It tests him in ways he couldn't have imagined. There's a huge underbelly that you don't see when you're considering only the glorious part of it or whatever. That said, there are still a lot of people who come back from that experience, not total cynics, but actually proud of what they did and happy that they underwent it, even if it contained a lot of darkness that they weren't necessarily planning upon.
Yeah.
And this, all of this to me, back when I wrote that article a couple of years ago about Bronze Age Pervert, I wanted to highlight the figure of Ernst Jünger, whom we've talked about before, because Ernst Jünger to me really typifies masculinity. He fought in World War I. He was wounded 14 times. And if you read his kind of, he wrote a lot of different diaries, but if you read kind of his most famous one called Sword of Steel, it's almost comical, like how he ended up getting wounded so many times. And like his narrative that he tells of like his experience in the war is neither romanticizing war, nor is it condemning it. It's basically just like a guy who answered the call and somehow miraculously made it through, and whose perspective on the whole event is basically like, if you weren't there, you really don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And he basically ended up with the same perspective on World War II, to be honest. Like, even though he did wear the uniform of the Third Reich, he was involved in some way in the attempt to assassinate Hitler in 1944. So at least he can say,
Even though
he wasn't
Hitler loved his book, and that's
right. Well, I mean, isn't that kind of isn't that in my view anyway? That's kind of the proof of his identity as a real man. It's like he understood the threat of Hitler, when he had the opportunity ultimately to get involved in something that maybe could have brought Hitler down and take Germany in a different direction. He didn't shy away from it. He was involved, although, the jury's still out on kind of what degree of involvement he had or whatever that may be. But it appears that Hitler knew he was involved in the Valkyrie plot and basically told everybody to leave him alone anyway. That he recognized in Ernst Jünger some kind of authentic guy. Now, the reason that I want to bring all this up is not to say like, okay, here's this World War I/World War II hero that we can kind of look to, but rather, I truly believe something about him that a lot of even his biggest fans don't recognize, which is that he had a real turn during World War II and beyond towards Christian humanism that led ultimately to his being received into full communion with the Catholic Church when he was 100 years old, shortly before his death.
Yeah.
He did not believe in democracy. He did not believe in lots of things that nowadays people would say are just kind of total prerequisites to being a respectable person in the world today. But he was somebody who ultimately, I think, exemplified, virtus, manliness, in a way that I think we really could point to now and say, let's contemplate that guy for a little while. Because talk about somebody who would have been considered a kind of Nietzschean Übermensch in some respects. He was the guy, and yet he was somebody who ultimately just kind of, he didn't really believe in that kind of philosophy anymore,
Well, yeah, Andrew, I think like a couple of years ago, we watched that documentary about him. And like, I forget how old he is. He's almost 100 in that documentary. But there's something too, like he really is like a Renaissance man. I mean, he wasn't just, like some, military guy, but not only with his books, but also there's a couple Beatles, I think, named after him.
Yeah.
But he really just had this great interest in reality and all things, and was totally kind of like, if you want to say, like, focused on things outside of himself, incredibly interested in cultivating that. But like, you mentioned that virtue and that excellence. I think that like so many of these guys, like with education today, being like, okay, getting this credential, getting that to, and it being such a process that doesn't inspire them. And so like when you like uphold that nobility or that excellence that you were talking about here, I think that really is kind of like a solution that would get a lot of guys. I mean, I hated education until I really got introduced to, some of the philosophers, and to think about things like that, and also connecting it to nobility, and that excellence, and that kind of realizing that beauty in yourself. And you think about that German tradition of the kind of the Bildung, of that formation into this ideal. That in so many ways is lacking in education today.
Yeah. And this is something, sorry to cut you off, and I think
Yeah.
you have so much more expertise on this since you're an actual teacher.
Oh, well,
Whereas I was once upon a time.
sometimes you're always disappointed how actually are you really bringing that about in the world, but
Well, but I think something that you're getting at, which is really important, and creates this distinction, I think, between these kind of like artificial, hey guys, here, watch my video, 12 ways to be a man, or like whatever, right? Is we really face this dilemma, which is this formation in excellence, this formation in manliness has to happen more naturally. And in other words, like, it has to happen in the family, but it also has to happen in the institutions of our society that expect that.
yeah.
And this is the thing that I do feel like we're really struggling with that, with the idea that like, and I think that there's a kind of nihilism, maybe we could call it on the right. Stopping short of these people that, again, we're not going to say are actually even on the right.
Yeah, yeah.
But there can be a kind of nihilism. I mean, even in the late great Charlie Kirk, there was a lot of let's just at least say ambivalence about our educational institutions from what he was saying, right? I mean, like, basically, most of you guys don't need to go to college. Colleges are, just full of nonsense, and I don't like that viewpoint. I mean, I love the idea that, like, of course, for the most part they are, but institutions of learning are the places where, for better or for worse, a large number of people, not necessarily everybody, yes, far too many people go to college, definitely, but even the ones who don't go to college, the institutions before that level still need to be ones where people are being formed in virtue and not just sort of given kind of utilitarian skills, right, that they can sort of use to make a living with, and then, oh, well, they're kind of figure out the virtue part from showing up on Sunday to church or whatever that may be, right? We need more. We need the institutions.
Exactly. I'm actually just thinking at this moment about an interview that Barry Weiss did the other day, with, oh gosh, I'm trying to find his name, but anyways, it's on the question of men, and kind of the crisis of young men. And I'm trying to find here the video. But anyways, it came out like 13 days ago, but she talks to this guy, I think his name's Scott. He's like in charge of he's at SMU actually there, Andrew. But he is running this program that I think he's in charge of this thing that George W. Bush started, a program where he's trying to get especially young men to read these great works of literature. I mean, you could call them the great books, but his conviction is by reading these books, this in which you're reading, the best that we have. You in some ways you start to realize that excellence in yourself, and so, anyways, encouraging, trying to in preserving the institutions and perfecting them as being immersed in the great literature of our tradition as being essential. And you hear these guys like Andrew Tate and even what's his name, Nick Fuentes, saying, I don't read books. I'm not going to even do that. The whole point of life is to, like, sleep with a million women and to make as much money as possible. And I think that's Andrew Tate. But also this kind of thing, like, I don't need to go to university or do that stuff, which I don't even think that, like, Nick Fuentes, I don't think he did. Even though Charlie Kirk didn't go to the university, you still felt like, I mean, he said he was watching all these videos from, like, Hillsdale College, aspiring to get, like, a real authentic education. But yeah, I think that the institutions, especially the educational institutions, need to do a better job of, inducting somebody into the nobility of the institutions and the greatness of the institutions that we already have.
Yeah.
But maybe, maybe not going fully in the anti-democratic tradition of somebody like Ernst Jünger, but still, you can't imagine Ernst Jünger being who he is without being immersed in that great tradition.
Totally. And let me read this line from Jünger. I know we're running short on time now, but I think this is particularly apt. Whether you, I think it's open to various ways of thinking about kind of how we might approach institutions today. But he says this in his great book called The Peace, which was his sort of short treatise, and that expressed his hope for a new Christian imperium that could have emerged after World War II. That is not what happened. The plan didn't really include his ideas, but there are a lot of great ideas that are in there. Well, I guess it did include some of his ideas, but this part not so much. He says this: the leadership of men cannot be granted to the nihilists, to the pure technicians, or to those who despise all moral obligations. Whoever places his trust in man and human wisdom alone cannot speak as judge, nor can he expound as teacher, heal as doctor, or serve the state as official. These are modes of life that end with hangmen in the seats of the mighty. And I think that this utilitarianism, this kind of disregard for virtue as the basis of society is something that is a real challenge that it's very much in the water, and it's a real challenge that we have to face. And I think that the call to a renewal of true masculinity or manliness or something like that has to start with something like that sentiment that Junger expressed in mind. I think it's rooted in the real, for one thing. It's rooted in hope for the fact that we can build better institutions. We can reform the institutions that we have. It's not too late to change course in this way or that way. It does feel that way a little bit, especially considering some of the data that we see in terms of income expectations, demographics, the number of children that people are having, but then also some of the things that Helen Andrews points to in terms of once an institution tips in the direction of kind of having a kind of female ethos versus a male one, then that ethos tends to intensify and grow once it kind of reaches that 50% mark. Anyway, there are all these things that we could point to that are that could lead to pessimism. But I also think, it's really all we can do to continue to try to look on strive for hope, for lack of a better way of putting it, which we've said over and over again is not the same thing as optimism.
Yeah, and this is why I think what we're setting out to do is so important, not to kind of hold ourselves too much, but that is precisely the thing. The men need a goal, to strive for. They need to be ordered in that direction. And with Christian humanism in mind, to promote that, I mean, what better, end and excellence to realize within oneself? I mean, obviously, depending upon the grace of God, but that which has been manifested in Christ, the God man. So, I mean, with that in mind, I mean, this is why I think, the project of John Paul II with Christian humanism and so many others, Pope Benedict included, and the popes of the 19th, 20th century, it's so important to turn to them to kind of have that proper guidance and direction. And it seems like, what's always encouraging to me is to see that whenever these things are being discussed, what's going on with the kind of seemingly that the Nick Fuentes crowd is not going away, that it really is a phenomenon that needs to be reckoned with. And also some of at least seeing that the left is seeing, hey, we've got acknowledging that we have a crisis of young men, that at least it's getting people to talk about these things a little bit and then start thinking of ways to actually help the next generation.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of talk about the vibe shift, which maybe is kind of helping reset some of these things that seem to be heading in one direction and one direction only. Like maybe the pendulum is swinging back and destroying the simulacrum in its path, and landing us somewhere near the real. But it's maybe a little more complicated than that as well. There are a lot of obstacles in place, but hey, what's less manly? What would be? It seems to me pretty unmanly to kind of throw up our hands in despair about all those kinds of things, don't you think, Bobby?
Yeah, yes, Andrew. That's a good note to end on.
Indeed. Well, on that note, thank you all for listening. Please do engage with us in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. It helps bring attention to the podcast. So whether you like us or don't like us, please do leave a comment. That will definitely get more people paying attention to what we're talking about. So we'd love to hear from you. We'd love for you to check out our website, spacesalviinstitute.com. Subscribe to the podcast, engage with us on social media or wherever you can find us. And until next time, God bless you all and live in hope.